On Tuesday, September 17th, at exactly 11:47 in the morning, a woman I had never met before told me she'd marry me if I could fix her BMW. She was joking. Three of her assistants laughed on cue. I opened the hood of the 1973 BMW 3 CSL sitting in her six-car garage, looked at the engine for about 11 seconds and stopped breathing. I knew this car. I had worked on it years ago when my wife Diane was still alive, when our daughter hadn't been born yet, and when the man who personally rebuilt this engine was teaching me how to listen to metal the way other people listen to music. The woman who owned the car had no idea what she had just walked into. She thought she was making a joke about a mechanic in a grease-stained shirt who pulled up to her estate in an old pickup truck. What she didn't know was that the answer to her car's problem was sitting in a notebook in my garage, written in my own handwriting over a decade ago, in a country she had probably visited but didn't speak the language of. By the time we figured out what was really wrong with that BMW, the woman laughing at me that morning would lose almost everything she owned, and I would be the only person standing between her and the man who was taking it. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened, in the order it happened, because the order matters. If I told you the ending first, you'd miss the part where I almost didn't go. You'd miss the part where, for about 30 seconds, standing in that garage, I genuinely considered just closing the hood, telling her it was a wiring issue, taking my check and driving home. Nobody would have known the difference. The car would have kept misfiring, she would have kept being rich. And I would have kept being the guy in the old pickup truck who fixes cars for people who don't really need the money the work brings in. But that's not what happened, so let me back up. Before we get into this one, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is all about real stories of people who get underestimated and what happens when the truth finally catches up. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let's get into it. My name is Mark Daniels. I'm 38 years old. I live with my 7-year-old daughter Lily in a small apartment above the garage I own in Millbrook, Ohio. The shop is called Daniels Auto Specialists. 2 bays, 1 lift, 2 toolboxes I've been filling since I was in my 20s. I have a reputation in a narrow corner of the classic car world for finding problems other mechanics can't. That reputation didn't come from advertising. I don't have a website worth mentioning, and the sign out front is the same one that was there when I bought the building. It came from word of mouth, mostly from people who own cars that are older than they are, and who have been burned before by shops that treat a 1970s engine like it's the same animal as something rolling off the line last year. It isn't. An old engine has a history. It has been opened up, adjusted, sometimes modified by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, and sometimes by hands that didn't. Reading that history is most of the job. The wrench work is the easy part. On the morning this story starts, I had 3 cars in the shop already. A German sedan in for a transmission cooler issue. An old BMW with a slow oil leak I'd been chasing down. And a Mercedes that belonged to a doctor in the next town over. A car he'd been bringing me for 6 years and wouldn't let anyone else near. That doctor is the reason any of this happened at all, though neither of us knew it yet. The call came at 9:18 that morning. The number was unfamiliar, an out-of-state area code. I answered on the second ring. I was already at the bench, hands clean enough. The voice belonged to a woman named Erica Madison. She said she was the executive assistant to Vivian Whitmore of Whitmore Capital Management. Mrs. Whitmore had been referred to me by a long-time customer, a doctor who had been bringing me his old Mercedes for 6 years and wouldn't let anyone else touch it. The car in question was a 1973 BMW 3 CSL that had been giving trouble for 18 months. 3 dealerships and 2 specialty shops had failed to fix it. Erica read me the symptoms: a misfire at idle, especially when cold, pressure loss in the oil system after extended driving, diagnostic codes that didn't match any visible problem. 2 shops had pulled the engine apart, found nothing wrong, put it back together, and the problem came back within 100 miles each time. That last part is what made me agree to come. A car that runs fine for 90 miles and then misfires isn't a problem with a part. It's a problem with the relationship between 2 parts. And finding that kind of problem takes either luck or someone who's actually been inside that engine before. I told Erica I'd be there by 11:30. I called my neighbor to confirm she'd pick Lily up from school, changed into a clean shirt with my shop logo, and grabbed a bag of diagnostic tools for a classic BMW inline-six engine. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of a private road on the edge of town, the kind of property with an iron gate, a long driveway, and a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. A young man at the gatehouse checked my name off a list and waved me through. I drove the length of that driveway slower than I needed to. Partly because the bluestone surface was the kind of thing you don't want to throw gravel onto, and partly because I needed the extra minute. Whenever I get a call like this one, an old European car, a problem multiple shops have already failed on, there's a part of my brain that starts working before I arrive. Running through the symptoms, trying to picture the engine bay, trying to guess what I might find before I find it. That morning, for reasons I couldn't explain yet, that part of my brain was unusually quiet, almost like it already knew and was waiting for me to catch up. The house itself was the kind that doesn't announce itself with anything loud, because it doesn't have to. White siding, slate roof, more chimneys than any one family could possibly need. I passed a pool that looked longer than my entire shop and pulled up in front of a detached garage that was bigger than my apartment. A woman was standing on the lawn between the pool and a six-car garage with two other women and a man. Navy blazer, dark jeans, expensive shoes, dark hair pulled back, phone in hand. Vivian Whitmore. I'd looked her up on my phone before leaving. 38 years old, senior partner at a hedge fund she'd co-founded with her late father's longtime associate. The fund managed over $4 billion. She'd inherited a substantial position from her father, Charles Whitmore, who had died of cancer a few years back. But the fund's reputation since then had been built on her own decisions. She watched me get out of the truck without expression. "You're the mechanic, Mark Daniels. Vivian, this is Preston Vance, my partner at the fund. Erica, who you spoke with, and Sarah, my assistant." Preston was maybe 47, expensively groomed, with a tan that didn't come from around here. He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The CSL is the second bay on the right," Vivian said. "The white one with the Batmobile stripes. I have a meeting in the city at 1:30, so we have about an hour if you need anything from me." "I just need to see it." The garage held 5 other cars, a Range Rover, a Mercedes SUV, a red Ferrari, a Bentley, and in the second bay, exactly where she'd said, a white 1973 BMW 3 CSL with the factory Batmobile wide-body kit, the deep front spoiler, and the tall rear wing that anyone who knew BMWs would recognize instantly. I stopped at the front of the car, not for the obvious reasons. The proportions of this specific car were doing something to my memory I hadn't asked for and couldn't immediately place. "3 shops have looked at this," Preston said behind me, "including the dealer, so if you're seeing something they didn't, I'd love to know." I didn't answer. I walked to the back and put my hand on the engine cover. "It's unlocked," Vivian said. I lifted it. The air filter housing was original, slightly oxidized. This car had been driven, not just stored. The fan shroud was original too, correct factory paint code visible underneath. For a few seconds, everything I was looking at matched what I'd expect from any well-kept example of this car. And then I saw the oil cooler mounting bracket on the lower left side, partly hidden by the wiring harness. I want you to understand what it's like to recognize a piece of metal. Not a part number, not a shape you've seen in a catalog, a specific object made by a specific pair of hands that you watched come into existence. That bracket was hand-fabricated. The geometry wasn't factory, the welding wasn't factory. The bracket angled forward at a very particular angle, a compensation pattern that one fabricator in Germany had used for years to improve oil flow under hard cornering. On cars he cared about enough to build something the factory never thought to build. Hans Brenner. For a moment the garage around me, the cars, the pool outside, the 4 people standing behind me waiting for an answer. All of it went a little quiet in my head. The way a room does when you walk into it carrying something heavy, and everyone stops talking at once. I wasn't standing in Greenwich, or wherever this town actually was. Part of me was standing in a workshop a long way from here, years ago. Watching an old man with thick glasses and grease permanently worked into the creases of his hands explain why the factory bracket was wrong, and why his version was right, and why it would only ever go on a car he trusted enough to put his name on. I bent down and wiped the bracket with a cloth. A small stamp at the lower edge, HB04, Hans's internal mark, his fourth personal project. He'd made only 7 of these brackets in his whole career outside the factory line. Each one was for a car he'd personally rebuilt. I knew because I'd been there for 2 of them. I held my position a moment longer than I should have. My breathing slowed on its own. My hands were steady but very still, the way they used to get when I was working on something years ago and a senior engineer was watching. "Did you find something?" Vivian asked. I straightened up and closed the cover most of the way, but didn't latch it. "I need to ask you something. When did your father buy this car? Why does that matter? Because I need to know if it was already restored when he got it or restored later." "It was already restored. He bought it from a dealer in Germany, kept it there for a while, then had it shipped here. Someone has been inside this engine in the last 18 months and replaced a part that shouldn't have been replaced." Preston shifted his weight. "Replaced with what?" "A modern aftermarket part that doesn't sit right against an original modification that's been on this engine since the 90s. That mismatch is what's causing your misfire and pressure loss. The car runs fine until heat expands things enough to throw the new part out of alignment, usually around 80 to 100 miles. "How long to fix it?" Vivian asked. 2 days to confirm. 1 more to source the right part and install it. 3 days total if I can get the part." 3 shops missed something this fundamental?" Preston said. I looked at him directly for the first time. "They were diagnosing a modern BMW. This isn't a modern BMW. This has specific modifications that don't exist in any factory manual. If you don't know they're there, you don't know to look." Vivian made a small sound, almost a laugh. "Fix this thing and I'll marry you, Mr. Daniels," her assistants laughed. Preston smiled with his teeth. I didn't respond. I latched the cover gently and wiped my hands. "I'll need access for 3 working days. I can work here if you've got power in the garage, or I can flatbed it to my shop." "Here is fine," she said. The amusement in her voice had thinned a little. She'd noticed I hadn't laughed. I wasn't sure she'd noticed why. "I'll be back tomorrow at 8. I drove back to Millbrook. I called my friend Carl Bremer that evening, 71, a retired BMW engineer who lived about 30 minutes away. We'd met at a vintage BMW event years ago and stayed in occasional contact. "Carl, I need you to confirm something. Hans Brenner built 7 brackets outside the factory line, personal projects. I worked on 2 of them. Do you know which cars?" A long pause. "Why do you ask?" "Because I just saw one. A 1973 CSL white bracket stamped HB04. Bought by an American collector in Germany years back. That's the car Hans brought into the workshop for a refresh. You worked on it. He'd owned it himself for 2 years and sold it to pay for his son's medical school. The buyer was American through a broker, Charles Whitmore, I think." I sat down at my kitchen table. I hadn't realized I'd been standing. "That's the family. The car's owned by the daughter now. She doesn't know any of this." Mark, Hans kept records of every car he personally rebuilt. Bound volumes, handwritten. After he died, his daughter Greta inherited them. She loaned them to a museum archive, but she can access them anytime. "You're saying his original logs are with Greta, available through the museum?" "Yes. With your signature on the work order pages. I've seen them." I closed my eyes. "Carl, I need a favor. A scan of every page from that volume referencing this car. I'll cover the cost. Within a week. I'll call Greta tomorrow." "Thank you, Carl." "Mark, you should know. Hans wrote a note about you in that volume, not just the signature. He wrote that the apprentice had the hands, and the question was whether he'd have the patience too. He used your first name. He liked you." I didn't say anything for a while. I thought about that summer years ago, the smell of the workshop, the way Hans taught me to feel a misfire through the floor instead of just hearing it. He used to say that an engine that's running wrong is trying to tell you something, and most mechanics never learn to listen because they're too busy looking. I'd thought that was just an old man's way of sounding wise until the day I actually felt it myself. A vibration through the soles of my boots that told me exactly which cylinder was off before I'd even hooked up a single gauge. After that, I never doubted him again. I thought about Diane, my late wife, not the client, who had visited me there for 2 weeks one August, who had walked through that workshop in a sundress, completely wrong for the climate, and laughed at something Hans said about American men, always assuming volume meant power. She'd taken a photo of me that day, covered in grease up to my elbows, grinning like an idiot, and for years it sat on our refrigerator back home. I still have it somewhere in a box I don't open very often. She died when Lily was 3. Stage 4 and fast, the kind of fast that doesn't give you time to prepare even though everyone tells you to prepare. I'd quit that job 2 months later, moved back to Ohio, and opened the shop with money that should have gone towards something else. I told myself at the time it was for Lily, so she'd grow up somewhere stable with family nearby. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I couldn't be in that workshop anymore, surrounded by everything that reminded me of a version of my life that didn't exist anymore. I hadn't been back to Germany since. I hadn't talked to Hans much after that either. A few emails, holiday messages, the kind of contact that thins out not because anyone decides it should, but because life gets in the way, and then more life gets in the way, and then years pass. He died a few years back. I found out from Carl 3 weeks after the funeral. The doorbell rang. My neighbor was bringing Lily home from school. She came in wearing her uniform, carrying a small wooden toy car her grandfather had carved for her the year she was born. She carried it everywhere, to school, to the grocery store, to bed. It was about 2 inches long, 4 wheels that actually turned, and at this point the paint had worn down to bare wood on the roof from how often her hand closed around it. "Daddy, can we have pasta tonight?" "We can have pasta." I went back to the Whitmore estate the next morning at 8. A young mechanic named Tony was waiting near the CSL staff mechanic, mostly routine maintenance. He showed me a clean workbench, gave me outlets to use, and left me alone like I'd asked. For the first 90 minutes I did nothing but photograph the engine from every angle, document every modification, write down every part number. The oil cooler mounting bracket, a reinforcement plate on the lower crankcase, custom oil cooler routing, all of it Hans's work, all consistent with what I remembered. I worked slowly, more slowly than the job strictly required, because I needed to be sure. Memory is a strange thing when it comes to physical objects. You can be completely certain you recognize something and still be wrong about the details, the angle of a weld, the exact placement of a stamp, the routing of a line. So I went over everything twice. I took close-up photos of the stamp on the bracket, photos of the reinforcement plate from 3 different angles, photos of the oil cooler lines following their entire path through the engine bay. By the time I was done, I had over 60 photographs on my phone and a level of certainty I don't often get to feel about anything. At 9:47, Vivian came in with a coffee mug. "Erica said you've been here since 8. Have you slept?" "Yes." That was a yes or no answer to the wrong question. It was the answer to the question you actually asked. She almost laughed again. She looked at my notes and photos without touching anything. "What are you doing right now?" "Documenting. Before I take anything apart, I want to know exactly what was here when I started." "Why?" "So if something's missing later, I can prove it wasn't me. That's an unusual concern for a mechanic. It's an unusual car." She watched me work for about 10 minutes, then left for a call. By noon, I'd identified the aftermarket part, an oil cooler from a California company that made parts for Ristamad builds, for owners who didn't care about keeping things period correct. The part itself was well made. It was just wrong for this engine, and it had been installed in a way that completely disabled what Hans's bracket was supposed to do. The installation looked like the work of someone who knew exactly what they were disabling. That detail bothered me more than anything else I'd found that morning. A mechanic who didn't recognize Hans's bracket for what it was might replace the part without realizing the consequences. That's an honest mistake. The kind 3 shops could plausibly make if none of them had ever seen one of Hans's personal builds before. But this installation wasn't that. Whoever did this had positioned the new part in a way that avoided contact with the bracket entirely, almost like they were being careful not to damage something they recognized as valuable, while at the same time breaking the very thing that made it valuable. It read less like an error and more like someone trying to make a problem look like it came from natural wear, rather than from a deliberate choice. I didn't say anything about that part to Vivian or Preston, not yet. I packed up around 4, told Vivian I'd be back the next morning, and drove home. That evening, after Lily was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up the subscription research service I used for verifying ownership history on classic cars, something I'd paid for years ago and barely used, mostly for checking titles before buying parts cars. I looked up Whitmore Capital Management. I read their most recent regulatory filing, the one that listed personally owned vehicles used as collateral for lines of credit Vivian had drawn against the firm. The CSL was on that list, valued at $385,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I pulled up recent auction results for comparable cars. 1973 BMW 3 CSLs with documented, verifiable restoration history. A real, properly authenticated example with verified Hans Brenner restoration history and museum documentation would sell today for somewhere between $1.4 million and $1.8 million. The Brenner provenance alone added maybe $400,000 because so few of his personal restorations exist, and collectors who know that world pay enormous premiums for that kind of documented history. The car had been deliberately undervalued on the firm's books by roughly $1 million. Not carelessly, deliberately. Someone had looked at this car, known exactly what it was worth, and written down a number that was less than a quarter of that. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the refrigerator hum, thinking about what I'd just found and what it meant, and what it would mean to say something about it. And what it would mean to say nothing. If you're enjoying this one so far, drop a like. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know to keep bringing you stories like this. Okay, back to the story. The next morning I called James Holloway, a commercial litigation attorney I'd used once before. I told him I needed 30 minutes and would pay for it. He had an opening that afternoon. I brought the filing printout, my photos, the auction comparable, and a one-page summary. He read everything in about 12 minutes, in the same unhurried way he'd reviewed my operating agreement 2 years earlier. No rushing, no interrupting. Occasionally flipping back a page to check something against what he'd just read. You're saying someone's been inside this engine making changes specifically meant to defeat authentication, and the car's booked at less than a quarter of its real value. Yes, and the person with the authority to do both is the same person, Preston Vance. I can't be certain, but the timing fits, and he's the only one at the firm with both the access and the motive. What's the motive? He's setting up to acquire it, maybe already has on paper, through some related entity. If he gets it titled at the depressed value and sells it for what it's worth, he pockets the difference, about $1 million. And if Vivian doesn't know what the car actually is, she has no reason to question the number. James leaned back. You know what you're describing is a federal crime, wire fraud at minimum. Likely embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty depending on exactly how it's structured. Yes. Why are you here, Mark? Why not just finish the car and walk away? You'd get paid, she'd be happy, and none of this would be your problem. It was a fair question, and I'd been asking it to myself since the night before. Because she didn't know what she was looking at when she asked me to look at it. And the man who built that engine taught me something about how this work is supposed to be done. You don't just fix the thing in front of you and ignore everything else you see. And if I walk away, she loses the car, and probably a lot more than the car. Preston doesn't strike me as someone who steals once and stops. James studied me for a moment. The way you'd study someone who just told you something that didn't quite match the rest of what you knew about them. I can't represent you in this, since I'm not your lawyer in this matter, but I can tell you what I'd do if a client brought me this. I'd prepare a confidential briefing memo with the documentation, find a forensic accountant who specializes in hedge fund irregularities, and find a way to get this information in front of Ms. Whitmore so she has time to verify and act before Vance has any idea she knows. How would you put it in front of her? I'd give her my card and tell her to call me about a related matter. Nothing in writing that could be intercepted. Let her come to me. If she's the kind of person who'll follow up on something like that, she'll call. If she doesn't, then at least nothing's been put at risk. He wrote his direct line on the back of a business card and slid it across the desk. I drove back the next morning and kept working. I sourced a period-correct replacement oil cooler from a parts specialist in Pennsylvania who kept a private inventory of old BMW parts, the kind of supplier most people never hear about, who deals almost entirely in word of mouth and has a warehouse full of parts that don't exist anywhere else. It arrived by overnight freight and I installed it the next day. The fit against Hans's bracket was exactly right, the way it should have been the first time. The seal was clean. The pressure test came back normal, holding steady where it should hold steady. I drove the car for the first time that afternoon. I want to tell you what that felt like, because it mattered to me more than I expected. I pulled out of that driveway in a car I had last touched as a much younger man, in a different country, in a completely different life, and it ran exactly the way I remembered it running. Same sound at idle, same way it settled into the road once it got moving. For about 40 miles, on a loop that took me out past some farmland and back, I wasn't thinking about Preston Vance or fraud or any of it. I was just driving a car that Hans built, and for a little while it felt like no time had passed at all. The misfire didn't return, the pressure held. The car ran the way Hans built it to run. Vivian was on the lawn on a call when I got back. She finished and walked over. "It's running properly," I said. "Take it for a drive, see for yourself." She was gone about 40 minutes, longer than I expected for someone with a 1:30 meeting in the city. Though I noticed she didn't seem to be in any hurry anymore. When she came back, she got out slowly and closed the door with the kind of care of someone who just remembered why they loved something. She stood there for a second with her hand still on the door, looking at the car rather than at me. "What do I owe you?" "3 days at my rate plus the part. 2,800 total. I want to pay you 10,000. You don't. Why not?" "Because I quoted 2,800 and that's what the work was worth. You can pay extra if you want to feel generous, but it won't change what the work was worth." She held my eyes for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You're an unusual person, Mark Daniels." I reached into my pocket and handed her James's card. "What's this?" "An attorney in town, he's good. I think you should call him." "About what?" "About a related matter. He'll explain, the sooner the better." She was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once and put the card in her pocket. She paid me the $2,800 by transfer before I left. She called James the next morning. 2 days later, he called to tell me only that she'd retained him formally and the matter was now under privilege. He thanked me for the referral and said he'd recommended she engage a forensic accountant immediately. I went back to my regular work, which felt strange for a few days, going from something with that much weight to it back to oil changes and brake jobs. Like switching off a movie partway through and going back to folding laundry. 2 weeks passed, the transmission cooler job got finished. The oil leak on the old BMW turned out to be a simple gasket, nothing dramatic. Life went on the way it does. Then a woman named Rachel Cohen called, a forensic accountant working with James. She asked detailed questions about my observations, the modifications, the timeline, exactly when I'd identified each thing and in what order. She was thorough in a way that reminded me a little of myself with the engine, careful, methodical, not satisfied until every detail checked out. At the end of the call, she said, "Mr. Daniels, I want you to understand, the car was the smallest part of what was happening. I can't share details, but the scale of the broader pattern is significant. Your observation is what led us to where we are." "What do you mean by significant?" 8 figures. I didn't ask anything else. I sat with that number for a while after I hung up. $1 million on one car had already felt enormous to me. 8 figures was a different category of thing entirely, the kind of number that meant this wasn't one bad decision by one person trying to get away with something small. It meant a pattern. It meant this had probably been going on for a long time, across more than just the things I'd seen. A week later, James called again. Vivian had decided to move forward with both civil and criminal action. The civil complaint would be filed in state court. The criminal referral would go to the FBI because of the interstate financial transactions. Given my role in identifying the irregularity, I'd likely be called as a witness in both. He asked if I'd be willing. Yes, the civil complaint was filed in early November, Whitmore Capital Management versus Vance and others. Breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of firm assets, fraudulent misrepresentation, self-dealing. Preston was served at his home that week. The FBI executed search warrants days later. Federal wire fraud and embezzlement charges were filed, then unsealed when Preston was arrested and processed. He was released on a $500,000 bond the same day. A few days after that, at 11:48 in the morning, Preston Vance walked into my shop. I was alone at the bench. Lily was at school. I heard the bell over the door before I looked up, and for a second I thought it was a customer. And then I saw the coat and the shoes, and I knew exactly who it was before he said a word. "Mr. Daniels, you shouldn't be here," he said. I almost laughed at that because it was such a strange thing for him to say. He was the one standing in my shop uninvited, not the other way around. But I didn't laugh. Something in his face told me this wasn't a conversation worth being clever in. "I'll be brief. I have an offer for you. I'm not interested." He set a folded check on my workbench. I didn't look at it. $200,000. In exchange, you stop cooperating with the federal investigation. You become unavailable as a witness, claim memory issues, claim anything. I just need the timeline to extend. I'm not interested. It's a one-time offer. You won't get another. Then it ends here. He looked at me for a long moment. Up until that point, his voice had been calm, almost businesslike. The same tone he'd probably used in 100 negotiations that had nothing to do with cars or mechanics. But something in his face shifted now into something I'd seen before in other men. A long time ago, in completely different situations. The look of someone calculating which threat will land. Running through a list of pressure points the way you'd run through a checklist. Your daughter, Lily, she's at Millbrook Elementary, gets out at 3. Your neighbor picks her up most days. Sometimes she walks to the bus stop on Elm Street. I'm told she likes the bench near the corner, the one with the maple tree. I felt something go very still and very cold inside my chest, the kind of stillness that has nothing to do with calm. I set down the wrench I was holding, carefully, the way you'd set down something you didn't trust yourself not to throw. I walked around the workbench. He took a step back, not far, but enough that I noticed. "Get out of my shop. Right now, I'm just observing what's in the public record. Get out." He held my eyes another second, then picked up the check, folded it back into his coat, and walked out. I heard his car start outside, and I stood there for a moment listening to it pull away before I picked the phone up off the bench. My hands weren't shaking. I noted that at the time, the same way I'd note any other detail. They were steady, but in the same too-still way they'd been in that garage when I first saw the bracket. I'd later realize that was the same feeling, just pointed in a completely different direction. If a story like this is your kind of thing, make sure you're subscribed, and let me know in the comments what you'd have done in this moment. Now let's see how this ends. I called Detective Mendez 10 minutes later, the local officer who'd been the original point of contact before the case went federal. I told him exactly what Preston had said about Lily, which streets, what the offer had been. He took it seriously and coordinated with the FBI within 2 hours. A protective detail was assigned to Lily's school and to my shop within a day. The threat was added to the federal indictment as witness intimidation, which substantially increased Preston's exposure. His attorneys started plea negotiations within a week. The agreement was finalized in early January. Preston Vance pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of witness tampering. 36 months in federal custody. Restitution of $14.2 million to Whitmore Capital Management. He surrendered his interest in the firm and was barred from the financial services industry. I testified at his sentencing hearing in January. My testimony lasted 47 minutes. The original observations, the timeline, the technical authentication issues, the conversation in my shop. The cross-examination was brief. There wasn't much to dispute. The judge sentenced him at the top of the guideline range and specifically cited the threat against Lily as an aggravating factor. When I walked out of the courthouse, the sky was that flat gray Ohio gets after a storm passes through. I drove home, picked up Lily, made spaghetti, and we watched the movie about the dog and the mail carrier that she'd already seen 4 times. She fell asleep on the couch with her head on my arm and her wooden toy car on her chest. I carried her to bed. I didn't see Vivian again until the last Wednesday of January. It was 2:14 in the afternoon. Lily was at school. Vivian came in wearing jeans and a wool coat, carrying a small wrapped package. She looked different than she had in September, not worse exactly, but like someone who'd been through something and come out the other side a bit quieter. "I should have called," she said. "You shouldn't have to." She held out the package, plain brown paper tied with twine. "Carl Bremer arranged this with Greta Brenner. He said you'd know what it was." I knew before I unwrapped it. The shape, the weight of it, the way it sat in my hands. Hans's 2010 work log volume. The original, not a scan. The actual leather-bound book Greta had kept since her father's death. How? Carl knew Greta personally. He told her what happened, all of it, the car, the case, everything. She agreed to lend it to me directly for 90 days. I'm supposed to return it in April. Carl thought you should see it before then. I set the book down on the workbench and opened it carefully. The pages were thick, slightly yellowed at the edges, hand-numbered in the corner. Hans's writing filled them, small, precise, mostly in German with occasional English notes scribbled in for parts that had come from American suppliers. I turned through pages I half remembered, entries for cars I'd half forgotten, until I found the one I was looking for, the work order for the CSL refresh. My signature was at the bottom, in the apprentice authorization line, younger handwriting than mine is now, but recognizably mine. Below it, in Hans's hand, was a short note in German. I read it once, and then again, slower the second time, the way you read something you want to make sure you're not misunderstanding. Roughly translated, it said, "The American apprentice has the hands. Whether he will have the patience is a question only time can answer. I am inclined to believe he will." "What does it say?" Vivian asked. I closed the book gently, my hand resting on the cover for a moment longer than it needed to. "It says he thought I might turn out all right. Did you?" I thought about it for longer than the question probably warranted. "My wife thought so. My daughter, I hope, will think so." The rest is harder to be sure about. The shop was quiet for a moment. A truck went by outside on the street, and somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. "I want to thank you properly," she said. "Not with money, with something that would actually mean something." "You don't have to." "I know, but I want to." She paused, like she was deciding how to say the next part. "Carl told me there's a classic BMW restoration program, starting at a track a few hours from here. They're trying to build a permanent workshop for vintage cars, the kind of place that does this work the right way, with the right people. They need a senior technical lead. The pay is less than you'd guess, knowing what you know about these cars and what people pay for them. But the work is what you used to do. Carl gave them your name. That's not your thanks. That's Carl's recommendation. He said he wouldn't have known to recommend you if I hadn't asked him about you in the first place." She allowed herself something closer to a real smile this time. "They'd just like to have a conversation. That's all I'm asking you to consider. I have a daughter who needs school stability. I have a business I built from nothing. I can't just move. It's only a few hours away. You could keep this shop and do both if it worked out, just a conversation." I looked at the work log sitting on the bench. I looked at her. I looked over at Lily's wooden toy car, sitting where she'd left it that morning before school. 4 small wheels and a roof worn down to bare wood. "I'll have the conversation. That's all I'm asking." She turned to leave, then paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "I'm sorry about the joke in September. I didn't know who you were. You weren't supposed to know. That's not what the work is for." She looked at me for another moment. "Will you bring Lily along if you take it forward?" I'd like to meet her properly, not in a garage, not as a CEO, just as a person. If she wants to come, yes. "Thank you," she left. The bell over the door chimed once behind her, and then the shop was quiet again. I stood at the workbench a long time after she was gone. I opened the book again to that page and touched my own signature with the tip of my finger. Like I was checking, it was really there. Lily came home at 3:15 with a drawing from school, our apartment, with a BMW parked in front. I asked if she'd ever been in one. She said no, but she thought maybe she'd like to be one day. She said the drawing was just in case it happened. I taped it to the fridge. That night after she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the work log open and the wooden toy car beside it. I thought about what Hans had written. I thought about Diane. I thought about the years between that page and the moment I stood in Vivian's garage and recognized a bracket I'd helped install when I was a kid, before I knew who I was going to become. Some things take years to come back to their proper place. Some things take less time than that. You don't always know which is which until you stop fighting how time works. I closed the book. I turned off the kitchen light. I went to bed. So here's my question for you. If you'd been Mark, standing in that garage that morning, recognizing the work of the man who taught you everything, with someone who'd just made a joke at your expense, would you have told her the truth right then? Walked away, or let the work speak for itself like Mark did? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think about people in your own life quietly carrying skills and stories you never knew about, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the people who built the world we live in usually don't tell you they built it. You have to learn to look.